let's start off kind of on the base level. How much money does the South African government spend, and how does it spend that money?
We spend approximately 2 trillion rand a year.
Mm-hmm.
And how do we spend that money? A large chunk of it goes to healthcare and education. A very big chunk of it goes to debt. About 21% of it goes to debt. And then once you account for pretty much debt, what we call the social wage, which is health, education, building RDP houses, which is sort of very small actually, and safety and so on, that accounts for 60% of the budget. And then you've got 20% left for everything else, which includes infrastructure and other critical things that we need to do that everyone demands, because we've got this weird situation in South Africa where people think that every problem is the government's problem to solve, and we only really have 20% of the budget once you account for interest and the social wage to solve all those problems. And the bulk of that should be infrastructure, of course, because that's where you get the biggest growth multiplier. And we've been trying to rebalance the expenditure because for the last 15 years or so, the South African government's budget was focused on consumption and not investment. And what does that mean? We were buying things, we were SAA spending 20 rand on a bottle of water. We've seen all the worst excesses of consumptive expenditure and how that gets lost through corruption. But not enough went into investment, and particularly fixed investment. And so one of the many markers for our economy being weak is what we call gross fixed capital formation, which is the amount of fixed assets being created in the economy. And there we've not had nearly enough. The South African economy can only really grow when you get 20% gross fixed capital formation plus. We've been at around 15 to 16. And so the composition of government expenditure has been a problem for the longest time. And that is changed in this budget. So when you look at the macros, the reality is healthcare is not going to go away, and it shouldn't. Public healthcare.
Yeah.
It's a good investment to make when it is run properly. Public education, similarly, is not going away. It's a good investment when it's done properly.
Yes.
All sorts of social support systems are stabilizing effects in our economy and stabilizing effects in society. And you don't want to tear up social stability either.
Yes.
So you have got to then deal with this thing called the interest portion of the budget, which is 20%. And if you can deal with that, then you open up more pathways for investment and for other kinds of good fiscal policy. So if the less you pay on interest and so on, the more you can start looking at the tax system and making changes to reduce the tax burden of society as well. So that's about roughly what the composition looks like.
And so just to confirm on that means that 20%, you said 21%, so 1 in every 5 rands is spent on just servicing the debt of the government, right?
Yes.
So that means that, and you say you're spending 2 trillion rand, but just over 2 trillion rand a year. So the government has run up a lot of debt to have that kind of interest payment,
yes,
right?
We have over 6 trillion rands in debt. That is, so debt to GDP is at 77.9%. And of course, this isn't great because once upon a time, not that long ago, in 2008, debt to GDP was 27%. And debt service costs wasn't sort of 1% of the budget. It was kind of a rounding error. And if you look at government budgets from 2008. And then, of course, we know what happened with the ANC's elective conference, which also coincided with the 2008 financial crisis. But then the long tail of the Jacob Zuma era sets in, and government debt just balloons. Our state-owned enterprise get captured and then have to get bailed out perpetually because it becomes a feeding trough for all sorts of corrupt networks. And the end point of that is that the state capture issue is not only about the institutions and the problems in the police and criminal justice and the capture of state-owned enterprises, but it's also the fiscal consequence that we live with now, which is that we have about 6 trillion rands worth of debt.
But why does a government kind of generally want to borrow money? Like, what is it trying to do to achieve there? And then where are you borrowing this? The 6 trillion rand of debt. Who's given this to the government, right? Have they gone to Capitec, asked for a small business loan? What's happened there?
Well, I mean, it would probably be more than a small business loan. I'm not sure if Capitec is the right group to borrow that scale of money from. So I think let's start with the second half of your question. Where does government borrow money? Governments borrow money primarily through the bond market. That's the one area. And then the second area that they borrow from is international financial institutions. So on the bond market, effectively, for anyone who doesn't know what a bond is, we basically issue a bond and we say, you give us this amount of money, R1 billion, 10 billion rand, 100 billion, however you're prepared. We go to auction, you can buy the bond, and it's a coupon bond. So what we will do is every year we will pay you just the interest portion on your capital for a period of time. You can get 3-year, 5-year, you can get 3-month bonds in some countries, 3-year, 5-year, 7-year, 13-year, all the way through to 30-year bonds.
Yes.
And we pay you the interest portion back, so you're getting the interest actively all the way through. And then at the end of that period, we give you your initial capital amount.
Okay.
And so it's kind of like the inverse of a home loan, where you're paying the interest portion as well as a capital portion over time. You pay, it changes over. It's actually the full amount on your loan is due at the end, and that is how the bond market, in the very simplistic way that I've just described, works.
Yes.
So that's where money comes from. South Africa is a very lucky country on the African continent. We have really well-developed capital markets that are very deep. So you've got big banks, you've got big institutional investors, pension funds and investment firms and those sorts of things. And so roughly 75% of the debt issuance every year that government puts to markets is bought out by the domestic economy. And 25% it's rand denominated. And so there's that. And 90% of South Africa's government debt is rand denominated. Only 10% is FX or foreign currency denominated. So we're not one of those jurisdictions who borrows in dollars, and then every time the exchange rate fluctuates, you have a balance of payments crisis.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So that covers, I think, the second half of your question. There was a first part to your question that I've missed.
Yes, which is, why is a government going out and borrowing money in the first place anyway?
The question is it good or bad for a government to borrow money? It is good for a government to borrow money if the government invests it in the things that will grow the economy. Now, largely, the private sector drives the economy and economic growth, and it is the job of government to create the right environment for business to grow. But part of that right environment is that you need functioning roads, is that you need the right kind of economic superstructure and so on.
Yes.
These things are big investments. Not all of them are the kinds of things where the private sector will put up all of the capital up front. And so there isn't a country in the world where you find the kind of economic superstructure is solely private sector funded. There's always either combination of government and private or government.
Yes.
And so that is where it's good for government to borrow money. Where is it bad for the government to borrow money is if you're going to use it to fund salaries, bottles of water that you for 20 rand a pop, and consumptive expenditure. So if you're borrowing for consumption, it's a very, very bad thing to do, and it's a sign of very, very bad fiscal management.
Yeah, and there's also a relationship that we kind of have hinted at in the way that we've talked about it, but we should make explicit here as well, is that the less debt that the government has, the less it has a kind of a line item in the budget that you have the debt service costs, right? And so the more the government borrows, there's actually an inverse relationship, because it seems the more the government borrows, the less money you actually have to spend on everything that isn't debt servicing.
Yes.
Because as your debt increases, your service cost increases. And so actually by bringing down government debt levels, you unlock a lot of capital to, reallocate to, more economically productive areas, right?
Yeah. So it's quite important in this medium-term budget. We've actually peaked debt to GDP this year after this dramatic rise from 27%, as I said, in 2008 to 77.9 now. It's now peaked, and it was critical to do that. And there are a couple of reasons for that. The first is the debt service cost issue. You've got to bring that down and not let that consume a bigger and bigger portion of the budget, of your public finance, because eventually you hit what they call a fiscal cliff, where you can basically cover your salaries and interest payments, and then government literally grinds to a halt because you're paying civil servants to pitch up to work and you're paying interest and nothing else. So it's important to avoid the fiscal cliff. And that was the first part of it. But there are other critical things. The higher your debt, the higher your risk premium, because the less likely people believe you will be able to service your debt. So In the global economy, there's what you call the risk-free rate, and that is what is the country least likely to default on its debt, usually the United States, biggest borrower globally, and what are the rates that they pay on their bonds, which is 4.5%, 5%. So globally, when you're competing for finance, which we all do, you're competing against a risk-free rate, and that is the risk-free rate. The higher your debt, the less borrowers will believe that you will be able to service your debt, the more interest they charge. And this creates a cycle where when you're on the wrong side of this, you end up borrowing at higher rates, which means that interest rates rise in your domestic economy as well. And when those rates rise, you start choking off growth because you then make it difficult for your firms and households to borrow for investment and credit and those sorts of things. And then that raises the cost of borrowing even more, and you end up in this vicious cycle.
Yes.
And if that cycle spins out of control, ultimately you end up in governments printing money, and then you end up with Zimbabwe and Venezuela, which you don't want to go down, a path you don't want to go down at all. So that's the second critical reason. And there's a third critical reason, and that is global sovereign debt will probably reach 100% of global GDP by the end of 2027, maybe early 2028. That is because governments all over the world are addicted to debt and borrowing.
Yes.
And they're addicted to freebies and so on. And it does not work. It does not result in positive economic outcomes, but unfortunately, here we are. At that point, borrowers are going to start looking to less risky jurisdictions. And we are now going to be one of the few countries in the world, at least on the fiscal policy front. We've got many problems in South Africa, but this is one of the many bright things, one of the few bright things, I guess, but one of the bright things in this country is because we're going the opposite direction to the rest of the world now, we will become a less risky jurisdiction, which means we will become even more attractive for investment as our risk-free rate is lower than what would be considered the global premium.